Thank you. I'm a little like the Grim Reaper. Nobody likes to see me because it's my team that comes in typically after somebody's been breached, and we're there to go in and investigate and figure out, okay, who broke in, what did they steal, are they still in the network, do they put backdoors in the network, and how do we go ahead and kick them out, and by the way, what was stolen, what type of data was stolen, which is particularly important in the health space with all the HIPAA and PHI information. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about how those breaches are pulled off, especially in the hospital environment, how those breaches are pulled off, and then really what are some of the lessons learned that we can take out of those breaches so that you, hopefully in an organization maybe that hasn't been breached yet, can learn from some of these things before the attack actually happens. And a lot of it, some of it's technology-related things, but much of it is organizational and practicing and having some of the right structures and policies and procedures in place. So first of all, who's attacking? Well, I've seen in the healthcare space almost all of the above being involved. We've been involved with some very high-profile hospitals that treat a lot of very well-known people, heads of state and things like that. And we've responded to attacks where a nation state has tried to break into the hospital just to get the EMR records of what the hospital calls their VIP patients, the really important patients. And sometimes these patients even check in under assumed names because their identities are so sensitive. And so in certain situations, you're facing an organized adversary, such as a military unit in a foreign government, where the hackers are paid Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, Asia Pacific time, to typically get assignments, and those assignments are go hack this organization for this information. And in the case of this hospital, it was go hack this hospital because we understand that a certain VIP important patient is there, and we want to understand a little bit more about his health profile. We've also been involved a lot where it's a hacktivist. So a hacktivist, particularly in the life sciences field, when you start talking about some controversies over how certain things are priced and how certain things are priced in the third world, we've had situations where hacktivists have gone in and really tried to bring down the organization to really make a point that they're protesting some of the policies and the practices of that particular organization. Those groups tend to be a little more disorganized. They're groups that sometimes are based here, sometimes international. It's more of a loose collective, maybe still working a little bit out of their parents' basements, but they're very much passionately and motivated, whereas for the top spot, the nation state, that's their job, that's their 9 to 5 job. You also have organized crime. You know, we've had some healthcare companies, even here in Southern California, that have been hit by ransomware. Ransomware is not unique to the health industry at all. It's across all industries. I just flew back from the Midwest yesterday where we had a client in a different industry that Friday afternoon, between 50 and 80% of their Windows servers, workstations, desktops, laptops, all popped up with a ransomware message basically saying all of your files have been encrypted, and if you want to see your files again, you have 7 days to pay us 22 Bitcoins. And the financial people at this organization are saying, what's a Bitcoin? How do I get a Bitcoin? You know, and it's shady how you get a Bitcoin. There's not a lot of up and up institutions sometimes involved in that, and so they've been trying to pull that together, but at the same time trying to restore from this particular breach and keep their operations running, which, as you know, in the health space is absolutely critical. And then insiders. We had another case at a major research hospital where we were called in. They had a feeling they were breached. We came in and we started monitoring the network, trying to figure out what internal systems might be pinging home and calling out to unusual destinations on the internet. And so we're using various tools to do this, and at one point we centered in on this one laptop that literally lit up like Grand Central Station. I mean, this laptop was communicating to several different countries. You could tell there were remote sessions being established through this laptop. And so we went, of course, the IT people said, whose laptop is this? And they said, we don't know, it's not one of ours. And what happened is a researcher, or they got an offer from a researcher, again, an overseas researcher. She offered to come into the hospital and do research for free. She brought her own laptop with her, and this thing had 21 separate pieces of malware on it. And because she was plugging into their internal network, basically it was providing a route into their internal network through the firewall that others could connect through. She insisted she didn't know anything about it, but even to figure out where she was sitting, they had to literally resort to, because it wasn't one of their computers, they had to resort to tracing the wires through the building and figure out which jack she was plugged into. So, in a way, that's an insider, and there's certainly been some high-profile cases of those sorts of people attacking different industries here in the U.S., and the health industry certainly is one of the top destinations for that. Again, what are they? What are these different attack groups doing? We see the DDoS attacks. That's something, later on, I think after this presentation, you're going to get a little more into a presentation about Internet of Things. Well, Internet of Things and DDoS attacks really go together because you have all these devices everywhere that are up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and if they get hijacked and taken over, all of a sudden you have millions of computers attacking a single host, and chances are that's going to bring that host down. You have other things around even sniffing. You think about, again, in a hospital environment, you have visitors in a patient room. Those visitors might get bored. They might pop open their laptop. They might start sniffing the Wi-Fi to see what they can pick up, if they can pick up any unencrypted communications, or maybe sniff the key that's getting passed around to authenticate to the Wi-Fi. We've had those types of situations where it's just more of almost a bored casual visitor that decides that they're going to try to get into some key systems. So a lot of different motivations for these, and many of these do fit in with the health space as well. I'm going to spend a little time talking about this slide because I want you to understand this is how these attacks unfold. And if we start over in that little green box on the far side, intelligence gathering. This is related to all industries, all types of companies. This is an adversary going out onto LinkedIn, to Facebook, to all other types of social media, Google searches, and mapping out who's who at the organization. We just had an attack I was investigating this week at a client where the attacker, through LinkedIn, was able to figure out who was the accounts payable clerk at this particular company. They figured out a way to entice him to subscribe to this system that would consolidate all of his mail into one place. His business mail, his personal mail, everything else. And this accounts payable clerk, pretty gullible, kind of fell for it. And this particular company used Outlook 365, so kind of the cloud-based email system. So what they did is, because they knew this person was a payables clerk, once they got access to his email, they hunted through the different email trails, which vendors were out there, which vendors were getting paid, who the contact person was, and they started initiating fake. They figured out which vendor was owed the most money. They identified a vendor that was owed over $500,000 of outstanding fees. And so they went ahead and pretended to be that vendor, correct email address and everything, saying, hey, we just want to inquire about our payment. He replied back, said, oh, we're pulling it together, you'll have it soon. The fake vendor replied back and said, okay, FYI, just want to let you know our routing number and bank account number has changed, and here's the new number. Person went ahead and said, okay, and forwarded the email to somebody else and said, FYI, this vendor has changed their routing information. Replied back again, just inquiring about the payment, and the payment got sent. Didn't realize it until a month later when the real vendor contacted them and said, where's our payment? And they said, what do you mean? We already paid you. And And so by getting access to his email account, which was an outsourced cloud-based email account with single-factor authentication, the attacker was able to social engineer the accounts payable clerk, and the company so far has lost over $500,000 as a result of that, because there wasn't much money left. This was a month later, there wasn't that much money left back in the account. And by the way, this was not a wire transfer, this was an ACH payment to another domestic account, which is often the way that these particular frauds are pulled off. So the intelligence gathering, that's something that's just going to happen. And what do you do about it? Well, if you have employees that are in very sensitive positions, perhaps you try to counsel them on maintaining a little bit of a more minimal profile publicly. That's really the only thing potentially you can do. But if even a low-level employee like an accounts payable clerk, they'll pick up on that because that's somebody that they can scam. Then they go and they execute the initial attack. So that's all about getting somebody to click on something, open something, download something that they shouldn't be opening, clicking on, or downloading. It's social engineering. It can either be straight from email, it could be a phone call and an email combination, but they're trying to con that employee into doing something they shouldn't do and get something installed on their computer that's known as a RAT, a remote access Trojan. And if some of your employees have local administrator credentials to their own computers, that exasperates the problem, because when they fall for that and they click the thing or download the thing that they shouldn't download, now that RAT is installed on their computer with administrator privileges, and so instantly the attacker is able to also pull any passwords that the person has on their computer, including if, for some reason, help desk, even several months ago, maybe logged into their computer to help them troubleshoot something. Windows typically caches those passwords on individual computers, so they would instantly get those passwords as well. So once that initial attack is executed and this RAT is on the computer, the RAT starts phoning home every 20 or 30 seconds, 24 hours a day, and it sends a little phone home ping to some, what we call in the industry, a command and control server that receives those pings, and the server's not even going to bother responding to those pings unless and until it's ready to actually establish a connection. And so when the bad guys, and oftentimes these guys are working normal 9 to 5 hours in whatever area of the world they're in, they'll come in and they will then respond to that little ping, set up basically a full VPN connection to that person's computer, and because that person's computer is on the inside of the firewall, now, even though that attacker might be thousands of miles away, they might as well be sitting right in your hospital, right in your facility, because that's the level of access they have, the same as that employee that is sitting there. So then what they'll do is they'll kind of do a next step, which is establish a foothold. So one of their risks is, okay, well, this employee clicked on something they shouldn't have clicked on, but what if they power down their computer at night and all of a sudden I lose my connection? I want to have 24/7 connectivity. I don't want to have to only hack the company when the person is actually sitting there. I want to be able to do it all the time. So they'll start to query the network and figure out, are there some other servers or other workstations, maybe some other employees on the network that just never shut their computers down at nighttime. And there's a way to query in Windows that'll tell you this computer's been up for 17 days, 13 hours, and versus this computer's only been up for 4 hours. Well, if you're an attacker and you don't want to lose your connectivity, you're going to target computers and systems that are either up 24/7 or are extensively kept online for a long time. So they'll start to crawl to a few other systems and see if they can use some of the same credentials that they harvested off the first victim's computer to now log into those computers and install their RATs there as well. And sometimes they'll use a slightly different version of the RAT, because in case the antivirus gets updated at some point and detects the RAT, they don't want to, again, lose their connectivity. Now, you might ask, well, geez, I've got antivirus, so why wouldn't the antivirus detect the RAT, the remote access Trojan? A couple different reasons. One reason is they're sophisticated enough that they actually have a change control procedure for their malware. So they will write their malware, they'll write their RAT, they'll compile it, and then they will scan it with all the major antivirus engines that are out there. If any of the antivirus engines detects it as malware, it fails QA, and they go back and they tweak it a little bit, and then they scan it again, and only when the AV engine's no longer detected as malware is it ready for prime time, is it ready for deployment. And so again, sometimes when they're establishing the foothold, they'll put different variants out so that if at some point the AV engine does catch up and detect it as malware, they still have a chance to maintain a backdoor because there's other systems that have other variants of this particular malware. So that's all about establishing the foothold and the persistence within the network so that 24/7, on demand, they can get into your network and they don't have to worry about a person having shut down their computer. The next step is they go in and they start conducting enterprise reconnaissance. So they start trying to, in particular, enumerate your Microsoft Windows Active Directory network. They want to figure out how you're set up from an AD perspective. Is it one forest? Are there trust relationships? Are there different domains? What domain controllers are there? What other systems are out there? What other systems can they move laterally to? And so typically they'll start with Windows, and the reason they start with Windows is it's a low-hanging fruit. They don't have to start running a bunch of noisy scanners scanning the entire network. They can use some basic Windows commands to figure out what are the keys Windows hosts they'd want to get into, what are some of the key workstations and servers, and then they'll start to move to those systems and, again, use any of the passwords that they've already downloaded and cracked to start to log into some of those other systems. And they'll keep doing that until, again, they happen upon a system where at some point in the past, a domain administrator, which in a Windows environment, the domain administrator is the god, they have the keys of the kingdom, they'll go to some workstation where the domain administrator at one point has logged in, they'll download that credential, crack it, and now they are God on the network. They can get into almost anything. They can crack almost anybody's password. They can even reuse some password hashes that they haven't even cracked to get into other systems. And so from the point of that green box up to the point of escalating privileges, whether you're a retailer, a hospital, a health insurer, a movie studio, automotive manufacturing company, that step, those series of steps are almost typically entirely consistent on the company's corporate network. And then once you get to that point where now you are the god on the network, that is where things start varying up a little bit. So if you are a hospital, now the question is, okay, well, what do I want? Do I want to start to log into the EMR system? Do I want to start to try to log into some other systems, get medical research data, get PHI, PII? And as long as any of those systems use Windows Active Directory for authentication, and even at many organizations, the EMR system, even though in some cases the EMR system might be outsourced, might be out in the cloud, a lot of times the EMR system uses Active Directory for authentication. And so if they have the keys to the kingdom for Active Directory, they're going to be able to log into your EMR system. Or, let's say your EMR system doesn't use Active Directory authentication, and maybe it uses something else. But as a matter of convenience, your employees like to choose the same IDs and passwords because they don't like remembering multiple passwords. Chances are they're going to be able to use some of the passwords they've cracked in Windows to now log into the EMR system and get access to some of the data. Then the next step is they go and they try to encrypt and gather data of interest and exfiltrate it out of the environment. And the reason they encrypt the data is, some organizations have implemented things like DLP, data loss prevention software. Well, DLP is set up, right, to look for things like social security numbers and things like that going off the network. But many times DLP is blind if the file is actually encrypted. And so by the attacker going in and encrypting the file and encrypting the data, it's going to typically get by the DLP system, unless you have your DLP system to basically block any encrypted transfers it can't see, which is kind of unusual because that tends to mess with a lot of things. So that's the model. That's the path that most of these cyber attacks take place. And one thing I can't emphasize enough, and I'm not at all an enemy of Microsoft. I'm not I've used Windows systems for years and years, but the fact that in our corporate environments, the fact that Windows and Active Directory is so commonplace that is why the attackers are really focusing on that, because there's just so many holes and historical holes in Windows, and many of your Windows environments have been there for years and years and years, and you kind of keep adding onto them and adding onto them, and typically you'll have user accounts, or more seriously, what I call non-human user accounts that have been around for years. The password hasn't changed for years. Nobody really knows what some of these accounts are for. Many of them have permissions, and there's almost a fear that if you go and you start messing with these account passwords and resetting these account passwords, you don't know what it's going to break because it's some software account that is affiliated with some package that was installed years ago, and perhaps the person that installed it isn't even there anymore. So it's a very, very difficult environment to really secure and to really batten down, and so that's why the attackers, that tends to be the common point for attackers to get in, because it's the lowest hanging fruit. So, breaches are very, very common. 85% of large health organizations experienced some sort of data breach back in 2014, and then 18% of these breaches cost $1 million or more to remediate. And some of those are fees for guys like me to come in and investigate, but also some of the cost of legal fees, PR fees, notification fees, fees with regulators, and so those are very, very costly. Many customers, and in our PwC survey, a lot of customers, when using medical devices or healthcare mobile apps, value knowing their health data is secure more than the functionality and the ease of use. And so just kind of remember that trade-off, because sometimes when we've gone in and tried to remediate at hospitals and we start talking about things like two-factor authentication and stuff like that to increase the security control, we get a lot of pushback because how's that going to impact the experience of the person? And so it's that balancing act of really trying to figure out where to, what controls to bring up versus securing. And things have really changed. I won't spend too much time on this, but you're in the situation now where you have health data that potentially can be accessed anywhere on Earth. You've got care available to patients sometimes through the palm of their hands. You've got devices and databases of health information out there, and then you have data from many of these devices that are stored out in the cloud, and so that becomes a big challenge in how things have evolved to really secure a lot of that. So in terms of even some of your network clinical systems, how do you go about securing those? So, first of all, it's trying to figure out who's in charge of these systems. So again, because many of these systems are not traditional IT devices, where does it fall? Does it fall into a black hole, or is there some group that's tasked with securing all of these other systems that are on the network? How many do you have, and do you know where they are? Do you know which ones, when you have all these different IP addresses on the network, do you know which ones translate to clinical systems, and then which ones translate to more traditional workstations and laptops? What's stored on each, and for how long? A lot of times these systems don't even need to store data that long, but they never get cleaned out, and so as a result, oftentimes you'll have months or years of data that is sitting on some of these systems, and it may not be necessary, and so you may have a situation where there's a risk there that if this particular system gets breached, there's going to be years worth of data on it, and in reality, you could have probably cleaned it out or moved it to some more secure area. Do you have enough staffing to securely manage these particular systems? It takes a lot of effort because with the frequency with which these new systems are coming online, there's a lot of effort that goes into managing and hardening and figuring out where these systems are. Do you have a procedure to actually go in and harden systems before they go on the network? One of the, I call kind of an FDA compliance myth is I've had some folks in the healthcare environment say, well, we can't really harden a system because the system had FDA compliance with this configuration, and if we start to harden it down, all of a sudden it won't be FDA compliant anymore. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not a specialist in that area, but I'll tell you, I've had other companies and major institutions that have gotten through that and gotten through some procedures where they were still comfortable that they could secure their systems and it's not going to affect the compliance of that particular system. So that's something for you to pursue yourselves. Segregating some of the devices from the rest of the network. So since these are very, very sensitive systems, how do you keep them separate from everything else? And then if you get new or unmanaged or rogue hosts based on the network, whether it's that researcher from overseas that brought her own laptop or some other device that gets added in by a vendor, but you don't know about it, how do you detect those? Because that's going to be happening all the time. And so you have to have a means to actually be able to see when those are going up. And then understanding how are vendors remotely supporting these devices. We've had situations, and I talk about RATs. I talked about RATs earlier, Remote Access Trojan. RAT also stands for Remote Access Tool, and it can be other non-malware tools such as Log Me In, Go to My PC, TeamViewer. These are all tools that are not malware, but still allow remote access to your network. And in the healthcare setting, I've had many situations where a vendor has insisted, well, no, we can't use your VPN. We need our own way in to go in and to support this device. And so we've had institutions almost forced into having these other third-party remote access solutions on their network, which if they're not configured right, they can be very vulnerable. And you don't really have a lot of ability to really yourself perhaps monitor what's going on. Are there people brute forcing these other remote access systems? So it's understanding how the vendors are supporting, and then how do you monitor over time if the devices are still staying within your standards and compliant. So one of the other things that I see a lot of companies doing to try to figure out what's on their network is running through some discovery and mapping to really determine what is on the network. So going out and there's some different tools out there to do that, to basically scan the network and try to figure out what is out there so that you can then start to place them into different groups within firewalls and routers, and then that's how you achieve some level of segregation of some of these devices. And so, for example, one of the controls you might want to put in place is restricting some of these systems from actually reaching the internet. If it's an internal system only, and the system is used for clinical purposes, it really shouldn't have an access path to go out to the internet. And that, by the way, extends not only to clinical devices, but also things like Windows domain controllers and Windows servers. If you think about those, the only place on the internet, perhaps, that they should be able to talk to might be the Microsoft site to maybe download a patch or download updates. It shouldn't be able to go to random sites. If you're browsing the internet, you're browsing the internet typically from your workstation, from your laptop or desktop. So that's the point where there needs to be some flexibility as to where you go. But your servers that are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, those typically shouldn't have unrestricted access to go outbound to the internet. Because if you remember what I said at the beginning about how these attackers figure out which devices on your network are the ones that they're going to target to put this malware on, it's going to be the servers that are up and running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because that gives them the most flexibility to get into your network. And so if you have those servers restricted from being able to directly go out and talk to anything on the internet, you're going to thwart and make it a little bit more complicated and harder for somebody to set up that type of process. Network monitoring, beaconing. I talked about at the beginning, one of the main ways that these guys get into the network, they put a piece of malware, they put a rat out there. How does a rat work? It phones home, it sends a little beacon out. So how do you detect that? Well, again, there's different means and means within monitoring and SIM tools and other tools to go out and start to try to detect what is phoning home, what packets are going out. And a lot of people say, well, geez, your network has so much traffic, how do you get down to figuring out what is bad? It's a process. It's a process known as tuning some of these devices to look for what is legit traffic versus what is not legit traffic. And this may not work as well in some health spaces, but a lot of times I have clients to say, well, let's start by looking at what's going out at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning when you don't have as many things going on the network. because typically your infected devices are going to be talking still at 2 and 3 in the morning, whereas many of your other office staff and clerical staff will be home in bed. Obviously, your clinical staff will still be up and running on that shift, but a lot of your office folks won't be there anymore. So that's sometimes the best time of day to actually look for some of the suspicious traffic that's out there. But again, you need special tools to be able to do that. And then look for large data transfers to external sites. So, with most transfers going outbound and most external IP addresses, you can do certain geolocations and geolookups on where some of those addresses are. And so if you see large data transfers going to IP addresses that are offshore and you have no reason really in your institution to communicate offshore like that, that can be a red flag to help pick up potentially that some systems are infected. And then you might have internal connection patterns. So let's say all of a sudden you have an internal workstation. Maybe your accounts payable clerk. Accounts payable clerk typically, right, he's talking to maybe a couple, 3 or 4 systems to do his job. If all of a sudden his computer is talking to 1,000 systems internally, that's another red flag that perhaps somebody has taken over his computer and is using his computer as a point to start mapping out the network. And again, there's different advanced types of software, security software that can look for those sorts of things. And then participation in DDoS attacks. We had a major DDoS attack that took place, I guess about a month ago now. We had a lot of devices that were participating in that attack. So when those are happening, check your own network to see, do I have devices on my network that are participating in those attacks? Because that's a time to potentially identify that you might have some compromised devices. This is a little bit about the structure, and I want to make sure I have enough time. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to have some time into kind of some of the lessons learned coming from some of these other breaches. But some of the major areas to look at for the cybersecurity framework is governance over the systems, and that includes things like minimum security baselines, sharing information with other healthcare and medical organizations. Network security, I already talked about that, network segmentation and access control, securing remote access. Risk management, including vendor risk management. We've had a couple breaches recently that involved third-party vendors where the third-party vendor, again, was providing some sort of a cloud solution to the company. They configured it wrong so that the solution was visible to the world, and so whatever data was getting put out there, anybody on the internet could access. But then it got worse than that because it turned out the third party had outsourced things to the fourth party, and so it was actually the fourth party that had misconfigured the system to make it visible to anybody on the internet. So it's understanding, particularly in the health space, what vendors, especially external vendors that you might be sending data to, which are the ones that you're sending the most PHI sensitive fields to and the biggest quantity of fields to, so you can start to prioritize looking at their security and making sure they're well controlled. And then it goes the other way with vendor risk as well. You look at, and this is not not in the healthcare space, but you look at the Target breach. So the Target breach, you had a heating and cooling vendor that got breached but had credentials, and so they were able to use those credentials to get in as kind of the patient zero, if you will, to get into the Target network. And so to the extent that you have vendors that are logging into your systems, that may be a risk there. Configuration management and patch management and change management, really making sure that systems are staying up to date on patches. There's another breach, the ransomware breach that I'm involved with investigating right now. The root cause of that breach appears to be a unpatched Linux server, even though the breach mainly affected their Windows environment. An attacker got in on a package within Linux that the IT staff didn't even realize was there, and so wasn't even patching it because it was a package that was installed as part of another software product, and it was a package that software product needed to function correctly, and so there wasn't even visibility at the organization that product was out there and running, and that's how the attacker breached the organization to get in to attack the rest of the organization. And then host security, data encryption, access control. Your wireless security standards are very key because many devices and wireless is much more important and prevalent now, especially in the healthcare space, making sure that that's very much secure. And then finally, I talked a little about asset management, figuring out what's on the network, what are the devices that are the most vulnerable to potentially going in and getting breached. This is another thing, and I got to talk about this a little bit because I work for PwC, right? We're one of the big four accounting firms. One of the angles that accounting firms and auditors are taking a much greater interest in is when there is an active breach, what's the crossover to the SOX systems, the financial systems? And is there any crossover between what's been identified in that attack and what's been identified within financial systems? We've gotten much more connected every time one of our audit clients gets breached, of going out and really understanding what is the scope of that breach, what hosts were compromised, what accounts were compromised, what malware and tools were used, and what's the whole timing of that particular breach. Because we want to understand, is there any crossover between what happened with the breach and any of the financial systems? And one thing that we found as we started digging into this is in almost every case, up front, the client gives us assurance to say, no, didn't touch the financials, it was over here. And we said, okay, well, we're still auditors, so we're going to still dig in and we're going to understand. Well, first thing that we realized is, okay, if you've been breached and that attacker has gotten that domain administrator privilege on the network, which is what I called the God earlier, the keys to the kingdom, that not only gives them full access to most of what they may have visibly attacked, that may also give them full access to several different systems, databases, infrastructure, applications within the SOX environment, to the extent that those use Active Directory for authentication. And so what we've found is when we've gone in as auditors and looked at these breaches, we found in about 90% of the time, the attacker did have access to the financial systems. And then the next question is, okay, we know that they did or they could have had access to financial systems. Do we actually see evidence that they did go in and log into the financial systems? And so for that, we pull out from the SOX systems the authentication logs. We make sure that as part of the investigation, they had scanned all the SOX systems for the existence of any malware or tools. And we look at the authentication logs and we say, okay, we know all these hosts and these user accounts were breached. Do we see any of those accounts logging into the SOX system in the middle of the breach? And about 40% of the time, we find that has actually occurred, where you actually do have logins occurring. And we've had a couple situations in the industry where there's been some delays in filing either a 10K or a 10Q, because there needed to be enough time to really understand, okay, we know they had access to the financial systems. We know that they logged into the financial systems. What were they doing when they logged into those financial systems? And having enough time to really have a good understanding of that. So the message there is, if you do get attacked and you do get breached, bring in your auditors into the fold earlier rather than later. Because a couple of the occasions where there have been delays in filing of a 10K or 10Q, it's been because the auditor was only brought in maybe a day or so or a few days before the filing deadline, and there really wasn't enough time to kind of wrap your arms around this. So something to really consider and add to your plans. Get the auditors involved early so they can understand what happened and any impact on SOX systems. So what I wanted to make sure I really had enough time for today is what I call some of these lessons learned. So a lot of times, right? I get brought in after the breach. And we come inside and, God, there's a million things the client wished they had done differently and that they could handle a little bit differently during the breach. So a few of these are on the people side. Who do you call for help? Who do you call for help, and what firm do you engage? This is something where a lot of organizations are getting both forensics firms such as ourselves, law firms, PR firms on retainer, and having that warm relationship so that if something big happens, you already know there's somebody you've already connected with, they know your network, if you have a cyber insurance policy, your cyber insurer already knows about them, so there's not going to be any surprise there when you put in the fees for the investigation or the claim. It's having that extended network, because someday there may be something where you are going to have to bring in outside legal, PR, and forensic help to assess more. People wish that they had grabbed senior management's ear more and talked to them more about privacy and security initiatives. Many times when the breach happens, there were things that middle management perhaps knew about, were challenges, but somehow there was some trepidation in bringing that up to the board level, and so the board may not have even realized that there were some of these unaddressed audit findings, unaddressed things that might be out there that might be negatively impacting. Most clients wish they had an incident response team that had met regularly, that they had practiced some of these scenarios and practiced, okay, who do we call? Who makes these decisions? I found this especially with some of my more multinational clients where they're calling overseas to get permission on what do we do next and how do we engage. And sometimes the organizations get into some paralysis where nobody wants to make the actual decision to call in some help. And so they lose some precious hours or days because nobody knows who has the authority to make certain decisions. Held regular training, especially training for folks that are in what I consider really sensitive positions within the company. So training, special training for people in your financial areas or accounts payable people, anybody that does wire transfers, they need special training because they're going to get hammered all the time by social engineering attacks. Special training for some of your IT folks who have the administrative godlike credentials to the environment. Those are some of the folks that need special training. And so you want to do some level of security awareness training for the whole organization, but then you want to deepen that training for certain really sensitive positions within the company. I already talked a little bit about the retainer. Had paid closer attention to breaches in the news to observe how the market reacts to different types of news. You know, I've been in a lot of different situations where as things are getting disclosed, but they didn't really know all the facts when they made the initial disclosure. Then they're doing another disclosure, and each time there's hits in the market as they're having to go in and say, oh no, it wasn't 10 million people breached, it was 20 million people breached. And so that's very difficult. Law enforcement assistance, this is a key one. So one of the most important things you can do is understand locally here in the LA area, who are your Secret Service and FBI contacts that specialize in these types of cyber breaches. Invite them out, meet them and invite them out, and have a meeting with them, or even invite them to some of your tabletop exercises so that you can understand what is their role and who do you call, so that you're not just going to the FBI website and calling the general number. You're calling a person that you've already met before, has already been out to your facility, that you already have a level of trust that if you call this FBI person, next thing you know, there's not going to be 20 agents storming the building and saying, please step up and stand up a step away from the computers. That may happen in the movies, but that is not how it happens in the real world. The FBI just doesn't have enough resources to do something like that. And so it's building up that trust and understanding, okay, what are they going to do? If you share some information with them, is the information going to stay private or is it going to stay public? What can they provide you back if you start feeding them certain indicators about who might be attacking you? Is there some help that they can provide you? Having that person, that face, is so important up front, and that's something a lot of my companies are afraid to do. But go ahead and do that. You can even contact me because I'm on the LA Electronic Crimes Task Force, and so I work with a lot of those folks. And again, they're very eager to get out to companies and do a lot of education. That's part of their mission up front. On the process side, knew what sensitive data you had to protect. So, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you get data that was out on some share, publicly available. It had a huge amount of sensitive medical information, and again, somebody easily accessed it and breached it. So, knowing where that data is, removing it, securing it in a different location. Tabletop exercise, I already touched on that a little bit. That's really going through the life cycle of a breach. Figuring out what applications each employee had access to, and how a breach in your Windows environment might impact other applications. We talked about EMR access. If somebody gets Active Directory credentials, are they going to be able to access the EMR system? Regulatory reporting, again, oftentimes in the health space, that's very critical. Understanding when the clock starts ticking and having some of those discussions up front so that you're planning for that the moment you realize that you've had enough breach. On the technology side, I can't emphasize this first bullet enough. Network logging enabled with sufficient size. I tell you, as an investigator, it really is difficult to go into an environment when the logs overwrite after 12 hours and there's not data there that is going to allow you to help investigate the breach. Because I can tell you, most breaches, the attacker is in your network, unfortunately, in a time frame that's sometimes measured in months versus days or hours, because they may be quietly going and doing different things before they do something that causes you to know that they're there. And so if you have logs that overwrite after only a few hours or days, that's problematic. Disk space is certainly much cheaper now than it was years ago, and so really making sure that you're keeping enough logs to be able to go back in time frames measured as months instead of hours is key. And that extends also to logs that to making sure the right things are being logged, to making sure that in the firewall, for example, that you're logging all outbound web traffic. Sometimes some companies won't log outbound web traffic because it's a lot of traffic, frankly. But that is typically where this beaconing that I talked about earlier, these phoning homes, those are occurring over the web ports, port 80, port 443. And so if in your firewalls you are not logging those ports and not logging successful connections for those ports, you're going to be losing a lot of information that would be helpful to figure out how the attacker might have gotten in. Had servers backed up and backups under control. Again, this case that I'm out at this week, this ransomware case, they're painfully finding out now that some of their backups were not complete. And so now when they're trying to restore from this ransomware attack, they're finding in several instances they can't restore. They also found out that their backup server itself was attacked and encrypted, and so they went through a huge delay in trying to rebuild the backup server and then reread some of the tapes to be able to restore from. So another consideration there is for ransomware type attacks, have some sort of a mirror, even an offline mirror, maybe of your backup server, so that if the primary backup server gets compromised, you have something else you can flip over to, and have offline backup media. One of the big attacks that hit SoCal a couple years ago, the attacker not only went in and destroyed most of their environment, they also went in and destroyed a lot of their backup information that was online and turning. And so there's, the only thing that's beyond the reach of somebody going in would be information that's disconnected physically from the environment, and so important to have some of that information offline as well. Let me keep going through here. Last point, I'm going to skip around a little bit because I want to make sure I have enough time to get to the last couple points, is more effectively manage security integration from acquisitions. I've had situations where health organizations have bought another hospital, perhaps, and now they're integrating that hospital into the environment. Perhaps that hospital had a very messy network and it wasn't really well cleaned up. Well, now you're bringing them in and you're integrating them. I've had breaches occur where, because the acquisition had such lower level security than the main company, that's where the attackers targeted and got in successfully and then moved through, once the networks were connected, into the main organization. And so really understanding how secure these acquisitions are before you go ahead and integrate them into the network. During the breach, and again, I'm going to try to go quickly through this, kept the circle of people in the know small. We've been out at breaches where there's leaks. I mean, it was amazing. I was at one major, very public breach where we would get briefings, and literally I'd walk out of the briefing room, and almost immediately there was some of the same things we had just gotten briefed on had already made the Krebs, Kevin Krebs online cybersecurity blog. And so it's interesting. There's people at organizations that will leak information. So you want to try to keep some of the information very, very narrow so that you don't have those leaks occurring. Fourth down under people, better project management of the incident response process. This is something that has tripped up a lot of organizations where if you're in an organization that tends to be siloed, where different departments and different areas tends to sometimes keep things in and not share with each other and not communicate like they should. Well, guess what? During a breach, that's going to still happen. And you're going to have people that are going to be finding relevant facts about the breach or the attack, and they're going to be holding on to those, and they're not going to be sharing them. One of the best practices I've seen is when it really is a major breach. You charter the largest auditorium that you have at your facility, clear out anybody that's booked it, put paper on the windows so nobody can see in, and have that be your war room, and literally have people, especially the first 48 or 72 hours, coming in and out of that room and having a giant whiteboard where the facts are being shared real time and other teams are able to see those facts and keep going. What I call incident response by individual cubicle or incident response by people dialing in from home, that's a very challenging model that really, really slows down the speed at which information is being shared. Information is shared best when you can try to bring people together and have a major room where literally you have all the facts on the wall. And you have a strong incident commander that's in charge of the incident. And this isn't necessarily your CISO. It's somebody with a very strong no BS personality that's literally making sure that they're pulling the facts from people, I don't want to say barking out orders, but giving commands. It's having that person really be a strong personality. Doesn't necessarily have to be an employee. It could be a vendor, depending on if you're bringing in somebody from a forensic firm or law firm. But it can't be a wallflower. It's got to be somebody with a strong personality to be able to bring those facts in and out. Another thing during the breach, people wish that they had acted immediately to remediate some of their vulnerabilities. We've had situations where there's been some delays, we really have to test this before pushing out this patch. And, a lot of times in a crisis scenario, you have to be able to start to push things out quickly and had gotten the patch and things implemented kind of right away. Another one under process, people wish that they had not reached out to the public too soon. I used the example before of sometimes during a breach, right? You go public immediately and you say it's this many records that got breached. Then you find out that wasn't the case. It was more than that, and so you're going multiple times. You obviously want to meet any of your regulatory guidelines for going public, but you also want to try to gather as much information as you can and let the investigation progress as long as possible before you go public, so you're not having these multiple cycles of going out there. This is another big one because a lot of times, before we get called in, for example, we have the IT folks sometimes try to gather some things themselves. One of the important things is under technology, taking live memory dumps before shutting down servers. A lot of malware and a lot of things only live in memory. And so the moment you shut down a server or power it down, you're losing some information that might be of forensic value. And so the better scenario, if possible, is to potentially disconnect the system but leave it running until the memory can be forensically captured. Otherwise, you're losing a lot of information. And then further down in technology, and this goes back to the log issue, is making sure that the logs have enough capacity and you're pulling them immediately. There've been situations where, facts are coming to light several days into the breach, and we never pulled that log, and now that the log was only kept for 7 days, we've already lost, 4 days worth of information. And so you really want to be able to pull some logs right away or add more disk space so that the log events are not overwriting in the middle of the breach until you can get all the information off that you really want. Last seven minutes. One of the things after the breach many organizations wish is, again, during a breach, it's a painful, painful thing, but believe me, you've got the board's attention and everybody's attention at that point, and so you really want to leverage that to the max. I've seen, huge amounts of spending coming out post-breach where, previously the boards were pretty stingy with information security spend, whereas post-breach, it was almost carte blanche. I've seen some situations where they've almost allocated too much money, and the organization had trouble spending that money. But you want to use the fact of, well, you're kind of hot in the news to be able to get as much information or get as much funding and resources as you can to help fix the environment and make the environment more secure going forward. So a lot of this, is takeaway. I've got about 6 minutes left. I'd love if there's any questions that I can answer for folks, because I know this was like drinking through a fire hose.